Picture this. It's 1991, and a massive nation is fundamentally rewriting its own financial DNA. In today's Explainer, we are diving into one of the most high-stakes, dramatic rescue missions in modern macroeconomic history, the transformation of the 1991 Indian economy. If you want to understand the exact crisis that forced India to the absolute brink and the monumental policy shifts that pulled it back, you are definitely in the right place.
Here's the roadmap for this Explainer. We're going to kick things off with the 91 financial crisis, then look at how they opened the economy, dive into the globalization boom, and finally, break down the winners and losers.
All right, Part 1, the 1991 financial crisis. Let's diagnose the disease. 14 days, literally just 2 weeks. That is how close India was to the edge in 1991. By the late 1980s, the economy was in a full-blown panic. India's foreign exchange reserves, which is the vital currency you normally need to import crucial items like petroleum, had dropped so incredibly low that they couldn't even cover a fortnight of essential bills. Imagine an entire country running out of the global cash needed to keep its engines running in less than 2 weeks. It is an absolutely terrifying scenario. And to make matters worse, no international lender was willing to touch India at that exact moment.
So how do you even get to that point? Well, the unraveling happened in 4 pretty clear steps. First, surging expenditure. The government was spending heavily on development programs, social sectors, and defense, which is great, but it doesn't provide immediate financial returns. Second, inefficient revenue. Taxes and internal sources just weren't generating nearly enough to cover those massive bills, and public sector undertakings weren't highly profitable either. Third, this led to some seriously unsustainable borrowing from banks, the public, and international institutions. And finally, step 4, soaring inflation. Prices of essential goods just skyrocketed. So the bottom line is, by the late 80s, government spending was exceeding revenue by such massive margins that the whole system simply buckled under its own weight.
Moving on to Part 2, opening the economy. Time for the emergency rescue.
With foreign exchange completely drying up, India had absolutely no choice but to seek emergency international help. They approached the World Bank and the IMF, and they actually managed to secure a massive emergency loan of $7 billion. But, a lifeline like that doesn't come for free. It came with incredibly strict conditions. These international agencies basically demanded that India fundamentally open up its economy by tearing down private sector restrictions and massively shrinking the government's overall role.
India agreed to these conditions, and boom, the new economic policy, or NEP, was announced. This policy introduced a framework that would quite literally change the nation forever, commonly known as LPG. The core objective here? To create a highly competitive environment by completely tearing down those old, rigid market barriers. Let's actually break down exactly what LPG stands for, starting with the L.
The first essential pillar is liberalization. In plain English, this just means putting an end to heavy restrictions and opening up various sectors of the economy. For decades, the rules and laws that were originally meant to regulate economic activities had actually morphed into major hindrances to growth. Liberalization was all about dismantling those exact roadblocks.
And honestly, the difference was night and day. Pre-1991, India operated under what was famously called the license Raj. Under that system, an entrepreneur literally needed government permission to start a firm, close a firm, or, get this, even decide how many goods to produce. It was a remarkably restrictive web of red tape. Post-1991, industrial licensing was totally abolished for almost all product categories, except for a handful of things like alcohol, hazardous chemicals, and aerospace. Finally, the market, not the government, was allowed to determine prices.
We can see this shift perfectly through the financial sector. Think of it as the anchor analogy. The Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, transitioned from being this incredibly strict regulator to more of a helpful facilitator. Instead of the RBI micromanaging interest rates and dictating exactly how much money banks had to keep on hand, the financial sector was suddenly given room to breathe. They could make their own decisions and even establish private and foreign banks, a real game changer.
Okay, let's look at the P in our LPG framework, privatization. This involves the shedding of ownership or management of government-owned enterprises. The government largely achieved this through disinvestment, essentially selling off parts of the equity of public sector enterprises right to the public. The strategic push here was straightforward and urgently needed. Bring in private capital and managerial know-how to inject some financial discipline and totally modernize these public sector companies.
And that brings us to the G, globalization. This is the really complex integration of India's economy with the rest of the world.
We're talking about creating networks and activities that completely transcend economic, social, and geographical boundaries. It's all about creating a borderless marketplace, where an event happening thousands of miles away can directly influence the economy right there in India.
All right, part 3, the globalization boom, opening to the world. Let's dive into how these LPG policies actually played out on the global stage.
So, what happened when India flung its doors open? Well, outsourcing happened. It was practically a perfect storm. You had low wage rates combined with a massive availability of highly skilled, educated manpower. Toss in the explosive growth of information technology and fast communication, and India, almost overnight, became the premier global destination for outsourcing. Services like record-keeping, legal advice, and this massive boom in BPOs, voice-based call centers, just flourished. India also really committed to this open stance globally. In 1995, India joined the newly founded World Trade Organization, or WTO, as a very important member. They advocated for fair global rules while actively keeping their own commitments to remove quantitative restrictions on imports and reduce tariff barriers. This made international trade smoother and much more integrated.
Finally, part 4, winners and losers. An assessment. We've seen the mechanics, but what were the actual results?
Let's take an objective look at the data. On a macro level, the wins are pretty undeniable. Total GDP growth increased from an average of 5.6% back in the pre-reform 80s, climbing all the way to 9.4% by 2021-22. But look closely at the specific sectors. This massive jump was driven predominantly by the services sector, which leaped from 6.7% up to 9.2%. It's totally clear that services were the absolute champion of the reform era.
And hey, remember that 14-day panic we talked about at the beginning? The turnaround there was absolutely staggering. Foreign exchange reserves grew from a meager $6 billion in 1990-91 to an astonishing $646 billion in 2023-24. Thanks to foreign direct investment pouring in, India transformed into one of the largest foreign exchange reserve holders in the world, becoming a highly successful exporter of IT software, textiles, and auto parts.
But this story wouldn't be complete without taking a neutral look at the sobering side effects. This reform-led growth did not generate sufficient employment opportunities. Plus, there was a noticeable deceleration in agricultural growth. Public investment in crucial agricultural infrastructure, like irrigation and power, actually fell. Meanwhile, the very policies that opened up trade made local industries deeply vulnerable. Cheaper imported goods began flooding in, replacing the demand for domestic products.
To really grasp this, we can look at the micro-story of a farmer named Mahadeva from the Anantapur district. Mahadeva grew groundnuts on a tiny half-acre plot, but when these economic reforms hit, subsidies on essential materials like seeds and fertilizers were reduced, which sharply increased his cultivation costs. At the exact same time, because those trade restrictions were lifted, incredibly cheap imported edible oils flooded his local market. Ultimately, Mahadeva couldn't sell his crop for enough money to even cover his own costs. It is a stark, grounding example of how macroeconomic liberalization directly squeezed small domestic producers.
I want to leave you with a deeply thought-provoking quote from former President of India, K.R. Narayanan. He said, "There is a consensus in the world today that economic development is not all, and the GDP is not necessarily a measure of progress of a society." It hits the nail on the head, perfectly summarizing the dual nature of these 1991 reforms. Yes, the overall GDP skyrocketed, and that terrifying foreign exchange crisis was completely averted. But when we look at the agricultural sector and the vulnerabilities of local businesses, we kind of have to ask ourselves, who exactly did this progress serve, and at what cost? That's a question I'll leave for you to explore further. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.